Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there is a certain expectation of precision.
Right, yeah, like engineering.
Yeah, like engineering. You break your arm, the doctor takes an X-ray, the image shows a jagged white line, and the professional just points at the film and says, well, there's the problem.
Broken or not broken.
Right. It is a binary reality.
Huh?
It is clean, and honestly, it is comforting. We like things to be visible. We like things to be categorized so we can fix them.
Oh, absolutely. We love a clean fix.
But then you step into the world of human motivation, into the muddy waters of why we actually believe what we claim to believe, and suddenly that X-ray machine stops working entirely.
It really does. It gets messy.
We are looking at a landscape that is murky and highly confusing. So welcome to Reformed Thinking. I'm so glad you are here with us for today.
Yes, glad to be here.
We're jumping right into a deep dive on the historical and theological realities presented in the Gospel of John, specifically chapters 5 and 6, drawing on some of the most thorough academic research available from Craig S. Keener's commentary.
And we are making a massive geographical and theological shift today.
We really are. We are moving from a very tense, very academic clash in the stone streets of Jerusalem right out to the rugged, rural shores of the Sea of Galilee, where these absolutely massive crowds are gathering.
The contrast between those two settings could not be more stark,
Yeah.
You have the elite religious scholars in Judea on one hand, and the desperate, hungry masses in the northern countryside on the other.
Two totally different worlds.
They really are. And yet, as we will see, the fundamental misunderstanding of who Jesus is remains consistent across both groups.
And the goal for us today, the whole mission of this deep dive, is to uncover the staggering theological reality behind one of the most famous events in human history. I am talking about the feeding of the 5,000.
A story most people know, right?
Oh, for sure. If you grew up around a church, you have heard this story 100 times. But we want to look past the Sunday school flannel graph version of this event.
Right, the basic fact.
Yeah. We are going to look at Jesus' direct confrontation with human expectations, his sovereign authority over physical reality, and why a massive crowd trying to crown him king is actually a colossal failure of faith.
It sounds counterintuitive, but it is true.
Okay, let's unpack this. Before we can even begin to understand the crowd's reaction to the miraculous bread in chapter 6, we absolutely must look at the confrontation that drove Jesus out of Jerusalem at the end of chapter 5.
Context is everything here. You cannot understand the miracle on the grass without understanding the trial in the temple.
Totally.
At the end of John chapter 5, Jesus is entirely surrounded by his opponents. These are the religious elites.
The scholars.
Yeah, these are men who have dedicated their entire lives to studying the law, to parsing out every single theological nuance of the Torah. And Jesus delivers a stunning reversal to them.
It's just a total shock.
He tells them that Moses, the very historical and textual figure they trust for their absolute vindication before God, will actually be the one to condemn them.
It is the ultimate rug pull.
Oh, it really is.
If we think of this like a modern courtroom drama, you, as the listener, can probably imagine the scene. It is as if your own star character witness, the one person you brought in to guarantee your innocence, suddenly stands up, walks straight over to the prosecutor's table, and hands the state the smoking gun that secures your conviction.
Wow, yeah.
You would be left completely speechless.
That is a highly accurate way to frame it. What's fascinating here is how the writings of Moses, meaning the first 5 books of Scripture, were heavily reionized in ancient debates.
Weaponized. How so?
Well, first-century Jewish commentators universally viewed Moses as the single most truthful witness of God's revelation. He was the undisputed authority, so people actively used appeals to the Torah, to the laws of Moses, to denounce others. They would accuse political or theological rivals of being betrayers of the faith or collaborators with the Roman occupation simply by saying, you are not following Moses.
Wow.
The law was not just a religious text. It was the defining boundary marker of their national and personal identity.
So, pointing this specific accusation back at the Pharisees, the people who meticulously, almost obsessively followed the law, was calculated to absolutely infuriate them.
Oh, without a doubt.
I mean, it is one thing to tell a casual observer they are wrong. It is another thing entirely to look at the foremost experts of the law and tell them they have completely misread the very author they claim to champion.
It was a direct strike at the core of their identity. But Jesus employs a specific rhetorical device here, the argument from the lesser to the greater. He says that Moses actually wrote of him.
Okay, right.
Now, surface-level reading might assume Jesus is solely referencing Deuteronomy 18, where Moses predicts a coming prophet.
Which is the standard Sunday school answer.
It is. But the theological research points out that in the context of John's gospel, this goes so much further back, it points directly back to the prologue of John. Moses literally saw the glory of Jesus on Mount Sinai back in Exodus 33 and 34.
Wait, let's pause on that.
Sure.
Because that is a massive theological claim. You were saying Moses saw Jesus on Sinai.
Yes. When Moses asked to see the glory of God, and God passed by him while he was hidden in the cleft of the rock, John's theology suggests that the glory Moses witnessed was the pre-incarnate Christ.
Oh, wow.
This aligns perfectly with a robust, historically grounded view of Scripture, where the entire Old Testament points relentlessly toward the Son.
That is staggering.
So if these religious leaders miss who Jesus is, standing right in front of them in the flesh, their entire eschatological hope, their hope for the end times and salvation, is completely, entirely vain.
Because they missed the main character.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Moses himself will judge them because they rejected the very person Moses beheld on the mountain. They trust in their own law-keeping, their own works, rather than recognizing the sovereign Lord of the law.
This speaks so loudly to our own human tendencies. Think about it. You can have all the right academic knowledge, you can memorize the text, you can follow all the rules, and you can still completely miss the sovereign Lord who stands behind the text.
It exposes the total inability of human intellect to produce saving faith without a genuine spiritual awakening. So true. If the religious elite in Jerusalem entirely misread Moses, how does this set the stage for Jesus acting as the new Moses out in the wilderness in chapter 6? Because he leaves Jerusalem right after dropping this bombshell.
He does. Because his true identity is vehemently rejected by the leaders in Judea, Jesus withdraws. He crosses over to the, quote, other side of the Sea of Galilee.
Right.
And this geographical move prompts a massive crowd to chase him straight into the wilderness. He goes from the center of religious academia to the rural margins of society.
Which brings us to a massive shift in the narrative. We have a colossal crowd following him. It looks like a massive ministry success.
On paper?
Yeah. If you were a modern metric-driven organization, you would say the engagement numbers are off the charts, the crowd size is swelling.
The analytics look great.
Exactly. But the text identifies a grave, fundamental problem with this crowd. They are driven by signs faith.
That concept of signs faith is crucial to understanding the entire Gospel of John. The text says they followed him because they saw the signs he was performing on the sick. Right, the miracles.
They saw physical healings, and they wanted to see what else he could do for them physically. It is a faith based entirely on external observation and personal benefit, not on spiritual awakening or recognizing his divine nature.
They just want the perks.
They are drawn by the spectacle and the physical relief.
Jesus is looking at a crowd of consumers. They are shopping for miracles.
Consumer faith.
Yeah, and if you are listening to this, you have to ask yourself how often we do the exact same thing. We treat faith like a transaction.
We really do.
We show up expecting the divine vending machine to dispense physical health, financial stability, or emotional peace. And when the machine stops dispensing the goods, the crowd scatters.
Precisely. It exposes the reality of the human heart. The natural man is entirely focused on the flesh.
Yeah.
And John gives us a very specific chronological marker here that we cannot ignore. He mentions that the Jewish Passover is near. Furthermore, he explicitly mentions that there is green grass in the place where they are gathering.
Which, to a casual reader, seems like just a nice descriptive detail. Like, oh, it was a pretty spring day for a picnic. It sets a nice, calm scene.
It is a historical reminiscence of spring, yes, because grass was not always abundant in the rocky wilderness regions of Galilee.
Right.
But John includes it to set the entire event in the specific theological context of the Paschal Lamb and the Passion narrative.
Oh, that is heavy.
The Passover is the festival of the slain lamb, is the festival of the Exodus, the covering of blood that saves from death. By mentioning the nearness of Passover, John is deliberately placing the shadow of the cross over the seemingly triumphant gathering on the green grass.
That completely changes the mood of the scene. You have thousands of people expecting a carnival, expecting free healthcare and bread, and Jesus knows he is walking toward a slaughter.
He is the true Passover lamb, and they just want a free meal.
Wow. In John chapter 4, Jesus lifts his eyes and tells his disciples to look at the fields, that they are ready for harvest. Here, he lifts his eyes and sees the crowds coming.
Right, the parallel is there.
But I have to ask, what do you do with a massive harvest of followers when, with absolute certainty, that their motives are completely self-centered and entirely inadequate.
That is the dilemma, and it forces a test. Jesus knows the crowd's flawed motives. He knows the flesh is entirely incapable of generating genuine spiritual life.
Yeah.
As the text will explicitly state later, the flesh accomplishes nothing, only the Spirit gives life. This is a core reality.
The flesh accomplishes nothing.
Human effort, human enthusiasm, human consumerism, it all equals zero in the economy of grace. So, before he addresses the physical hunger of the 5,000, he decides to test the disciples' understanding of his identity.
He targets Philip. He looks right at Philip and asks, where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?
Right.
And I find this fascinating because Judas is the one who holds the money bag for the group. If this were a legitimate logistical question, you go to the treasurer.
You would think so.
You ask the guy with the ledger. But Jesus singles out Philip.
He does. Ancient teachers frequently tested their disciples' resolve and understanding, but in the grander biblical framework, this deliberately echoes God testing Israel in the wilderness during the Exodus.
Oh, like the manna.
Yes. God would bring Israel to a place of complete resource depletion, no water, no food, to expose their hearts and test their reliance on him.
Wow.
God does this to demonstrate that man does not live on bread alone. Jesus is doing the same thing to Philip. He is putting Philip in a situation of absolute, undeniable scarcity.
It is like a corporate stress test.
Stress test.
Yeah, like management walks up to an employee, hands them an impossibly massive project, provides absolutely zero budget, and just stands back to watch their methodology fail.
That is a brilliant way to put it.
Because the math here is literally staggering. You have thousands of hungry people and no infrastructure to feed them.
Let us run the numbers, because the historical research breaks this down wonderfully. Philip responds by saying that 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get even a little.
Right, 200 denarii.
In the first century agrarian economy, 200 denarii equals roughly 200 days' wages for an average laborer.
That is more than half a year's salary just sitting there in the dust.
Correct. And during times of food shortages, which were common under Roman taxation and the unpredictable agricultural cycles, a single day's wage barely fed a poor family.
It was a subsistence living.
Exactly. So 200 days' wages is laughably, hopelessly inadequate for 5,000 men, not even counting the women and children who were undoubtedly present.
So the math is just impossible.
Philip looks at the spreadsheet, and the spreadsheet says they are entirely bankrupt.
So the financial resources are a dead end. Philip fails the test of faith because he only looks at the material reality.
Right.
Then Andrew chimes in, and he offers a solution that almost seems like a joke. He finds a lad with 5 barley loaves and 2 dried fish. The text points out a detail here that is so easily missed, the barley.
Barley was the food of the absolute poorest classes. It was cheaper, rougher, and much less desirable than wheat.
It was peasant food.
In the social hierarchy of food, wheat was for the wealthy and the comfortable. Barley was for the destitute. The fact that this boy had barley loaves indicates his low socioeconomic status. He is at the absolute bottom of the social ladder.
And this boy is a completely silent protagonist. He represents the people without any social influence or leverage. He has no voice in the narrative.
None at all.
He just hands over his poor man's lunch. But I'm still stuck on the test itself. I want to look at the motive behind the question. Why does Jesus demand a human solution when he knows with absolute divine certainty that the physical resources are entirely, completely insufficient?
It is a fair question.
What is the theological point of making Philip and Andrew squirm in front of thousands of people?
To thoroughly expose human inability. It is a core principle in understanding our relationship with the divine.
Okay.
Until the disciples, and by extension you as the reader, realize that natural means are completely bankrupt in the face of this magnitude of need, they will not properly attribute the coming provision to Jesus' sovereign grace.
Ah, I see.
The human solutions had to be exhausted and proven absurd, so that the divine solution could be recognized for what it was. If they had 200 denarii, they might have tried to buy the bread and take the credit for the logistics.
It would be the heroes.
Jesus removes all possibility of human boasting.
That hits hard. We always want to bring our own resume to the table. You want to bring your own 200 denarii.
We really do.
You want to offer your good works, your intellectual arguments, your moral track record. And Jesus says, well, it is not enough. Your flesh accomplishes nothing.
Nothing at all.
So the disciples' inability is thoroughly exposed on the green grass. The deficit is established beyond any doubt. And this is the moment Jesus steps in to demonstrate his absolute, unmitigated authority over the material world.
He issues a command. He orders the vast crowd to recline.
Which the cultural research notes is a specific posture.
Yes. For normal, everyday meals, people in that era sat. But they reclined at banquets and major festivals. This was a Greek custom that had been widely adopted across the Mediterranean, especially for celebrations like the Passover.
So it changes the whole vibe.
By having them recline, Jesus is signaling that this is not a hurried snack in the dirt. This is a banquet. He is the host of a massive, formal feast in the middle of nowhere.
A feast in the wilderness.
He is setting a table in the wilderness, fulfilling the Old Testament imagery of God providing a feast for his people.
He takes the loaves and he gives thanks.
Which was the traditional Jewish blessing. The standard prayer was, "Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth."
This is beautiful.
It is a it is a staggering acknowledgement of God as the ultimate provider of sustenance. It directs all the glory to the Father, and then he distributes the food.
Now, we need to address something here regarding modern skepticism, because you read this, and the modern rational mind immediately tries to find a loophole.
They always do.
Maybe people had food hidden in their cloaks, and the boys sharing inspired everyone to share. You hear these psychological explanations all the time, from people trying to strip the supernatural elements out of the text.
We do. Skepticism often arises purely from anti-supernatural assumptions.
Right.
If you start with the premise that miracles cannot happen, you will force the text into a naturalistic box, no matter how awkward the fit. You will invent theories about hidden food and spontaneous communal sharing.
Just to make it make sense to a modern mind.
But historically speaking, the evidence points firmly to a massive, inexplicable event. This miracle is attested across multiple independent gospel traditions. It is one of the most widely verified events in the entire narrative of Jesus' life.
And John's account has a very specific detail that completely ruins the everyone shared their lunch theory.
Exactly. In the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the massive crowd seems somewhat oblivious to the actual source of the food.
They're just eating.
They just eat and are satisfied. But in John's account, the crowd is fully aware that a supernatural multiplication has taken place.
How do we know that?
We know they are aware because of their immediate, aggressive political reaction right after the meal. They saw the miracle happen. They saw the physical matter multiply in his hands.
You cannot build a violent political draft around a guy who just successfully convinced people to share their trail mix.
No, you cannot.
That does not spark a revolution. They saw a suspension of the laws of physics.
It did.
Let us look at the leftovers. 12 baskets full. Why so much? Why not just provide exactly enough for everyone to have a single piece?
There is a fascinating intersection of cultures here. In the Greco-Roman world, a truly good, honorable host was culturally obligated to provide such an abundant feast that there were substantial leftovers.
Just expected.
It proved his wealth and his generosity. A host who only provided enough to scrape by was considered shameful.
It is a flex of hospitality. Jesus is showing that the resources of heaven are not strained by human need.
Precisely. But contrast this with the Old Testament manna in the wilderness.
Okay, yeah.
When God provided manna for the Israelites, they were strictly commanded not to leave any over for the next day except on the Sabbath. If they tried to hoard it, it bred worms and rotted.
Right, the manna would spoil.
The manna was a daily test of dependence. They had to trust God for tomorrow's bread.
But Jesus commands the fragments to be gathered here. It does not rot. It is preserved.
Right. Jesus' provision is superior. It is abundant and lasting. But the command to gather the fragments also reflects ancient moral teachings.
Like what?
Throughout the Mediterranean, and specifically within Jewish thought, squandering food was viewed as highly immoral. The moral ideal was massive generosity combined with strict frugality.
That is an interesting combo.
You provide abundantly, but you waste nothing. God's grace is lavish, but it is never reckless. It is never meant to be discarded.
What about the number 12? 12 baskets. I have heard people preach entire sermons allegorizing the 12 baskets, one for each disciple, or one for each tribe of Israel.
You do see that a lot.
Yeah, you see commentators bending over backwards to find a hidden numerical code.
The best historical research advises against forcing an allegory there. The simplest, most historically grounded explanation is that 12 was the maximum number of baskets the 12 disciples could physically carry.
Just logistics.
Each man grabbed a basket. It highlights the sheer volume of the physical abundance, the undeniable reality of the miracle, rather than a secret numeric code.
I love that the text points out a specific phrasing in John's account. In the other Gospels, Jesus gives the bread to the disciples, and the disciples distribute it to the crowd.
Right.
But John specifically portrays Jesus distributing the bread himself. The text says, Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated.
That is a very deliberate authorial choice by John.
I want to know why that matters. How does that specific framing, cutting out the middleman, alter our understanding of who is truly in control of the situation?
John wants to highlight Jesus' absolute sovereignty and control over the entire event. He is not a distant manager delegating tasks to his subordinates. He is the direct, unmediated source of life and provision.
He is hands-on.
It keeps the theological focus relentlessly on the person of Christ rather than the agency of the disciples. The disciples are entirely passive in the distribution process in John's account. Jesus is the true bread, and he gives himself. He requires no human assistance to accomplish his will.
Okay, so the crowd is eaten. They are completely full. They have witnessed this undeniable, physics-defying multiplication of bread.
Yes.
And the sheer abundance of this miracle triggers a radical, aggressive response. We hit a massive crisis of kingship in verses 14 and 15. The mood shifts from a peaceful picnic to a volatile political situation.
The crowd looks at what Jesus just did, and they correctly identify him as the prophet. The text says, when the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world."
Which goes back to Moses.
This is a direct callback to Deuteronomy 18, the prophet like Moses, who was promised to come. They get the title right, they recognize the category.
But they get the job description entirely wrong.
Entirely.
Because their immediate reaction is to try and make him king by absolute force. They want to kidnap him and crown him. The text literally says they were about to come and take him by force to make him king.
And Jesus' reaction is instantaneous. He withdraws to the mountain alone.
Just leaves them there.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we can clearly see the lethal danger of their misunderstanding. Think about the historical context.
Okay.
The crowd in Galilee is suffering under Roman occupation. They are heavily taxed, marginalized, and dreaming of the days of King David. When they see a man who can feed an army of 5,000 men in the wilderness out of thin air, they do not see a savior from sin.
What do they see?
They see the ultimate military quartermaster.
Wow, they see a logistical cheat code for a violent revolution.
That is it.
If you have a general who can feed an army without supply lines, you can march on Rome tomorrow.
Exactly. First-century Palestine was a powder keg. Wilderness prophets who promised massive signs regularly sparked violent, bloody revolts.
The Zealots?
Groups like the Zealots were always looking for a spark to ignite a war against the Romans, and those revolts always drew the immediate, lethal attention of rulers like Herod Antipas and the Roman legions.
So it was incredibly dangerous.
The crowd wants a political and military liberator. They want Jesus to march on Jerusalem, overthrow the Romans, and establish an earthly kingdom of endless bread and autonomy.
It is a hostile political draft.
A draft, yes.
It is like a mob trying to force a candidate to run for office on a platform the candidate fundamentally opposes. They want to hijack his authority for their own fleshly agenda.
Yeah.
They want to use him.
And this reveals the fatal flaw in their science faith. They do not want to submit to a sovereign God. They want a sovereign God to submit to their political and physical desires.
They want to be in charge.
Their hearts are completely unregenerate, but Jesus' kingdom is not of this world. He refuses to receive his kingship from human acclamation or mob support. He will secure his kingship by proclaiming the truth, and in the end, by being lifted up on a Roman cross, bleeding and dying to save a rebellious people. That is not the king the crowd wants. They want a king of glory, not a king of suffering.
Since Jesus, as John constantly points out to us, knows the human heart, he knows exactly what this mob is planning, he knows their motives are corrupt, how does he dismantle their expectations without triggering the very riot they want?
It is a tense moment.
Because if you stand up and say no to a mob of 5,000 men, things get violent quickly.
He simply removes himself. He refuses to engage on their terms. He withdraws again to the mountain by himself, ascending alone, leaving them without their figurehead.
He just vanishes.
It is a severe rejection of their fleshly desires. He will not be used by them. He will not allow his divine mission to be co-opted by human political agendas.
Which leaves the disciples in a very weird spot. Fleeing this frenzied political mob, Jesus sends his disciples onto the sea. He puts them in a boat and sends them away into the night, which leads to a terrifying private revelation.
It is a massive contrast to the public misunderstanding we just saw on the shore.
The disciples are rowing across the Sea of Galilee in the dark, and a violent storm arises. The sea is historically known for these sudden, violent squalls due to the surrounding geography.
The winds just drop down.
The text notes they had rowed a massive distance, about 3 or 4 miles, putting them in the very deep part of the lake. They were completely isolated, battling the wind and the waves.
And then Jesus walks to them on the water.
The academic research notes that this account stems from a very early, highly reliable tradition, and the scholars sharply refute the rationalistic attempts to explain this away.
Right, the sandbar theory.
Yes.
If you read some of the older, more liberal commentators, they suggest Jesus was just waiting in the shallows on a hidden sandbar, and the disciples were confused by the fog and their own exhaustion.
Which is an insult to the intelligence of the disciples. Remember who is in that boat?
Yeah, they were fishermen. Peter, Andrew, James, and John are seasoned professional fishermen. They have spent their entire lives on this specific body of water. They know the depths, they know the shallows, and the text explicitly states they were miles out into the deep water.
They would not be fooled.
Seasoned fishermen fighting for their lives in a squall would never be fooled by a man wading in ankle-deep water near the shore. They know where they are.
It is a terrifying image. Imagine you are in that boat. You are battling the waves, completely exhausted, your muscles are burning from rowing against a gale-force wind, and suddenly a figure is striding across the chaos of the sea.
It is terrifying.
While the massive crowd on the land saw a physical sign, the bread, and misunderstood it completely, the disciples out on the water received this terrifying private sign. I will look at the timing of this.
Okay.
Why does Jesus choose this specific moment? Why reveal his absolute command over the chaotic forces of nature in the dark, in the middle of a storm, immediately after refusing a golden crown from a loving mob?
It is a declaration of his true nature, specifically reserved for his own. The crowd wanted a king who could manipulate the earthly system, feed armies, fight Romans.
Right.
Jesus, by walking on the chaotic waters, is aligning himself with the creator God of the Old Testament. In Job chapter 9, verse 8, it says, God alone stretches out the heavens and tramples the waves of the sea.
Trampling the waves.
Trampling the waves is a divine prerogative. When Jesus approaches the terrified disciples, he speaks to them over the roar of the wind. He says, "It is I, do not be afraid."
Wow.
In the original Greek text, that phrase is ego eimi, I am. The divine name revealed to Moses at the burning bush. He is showing them that his authority is not a political one, it is cosmological.
He is the sovereign Lord.
He is the sovereign Lord of creation. He refused the earthly crown from the crowd because he already wears the crown of the universe.
He does not need their endorsement. He does not need human votes to establish his throne.
He does not.
Yeah.
And notice the outcome. As soon as they willingly receive him into the boat, they immediately were to their destination.
Just like that.
The fleshly crowd on the shore wanted to capture Jesus to use him for their own ends. The disciples, tested and terrified, simply receive him, and he brings them to safety. It is a stunning picture of divine rescue.
The contrast is brilliant. It exposes two entirely different ways of approaching God. One way demands that God validate our desires.
The consumer way.
Yeah, it demands that God fix our temporary problems and establish our preferred political order. The other way submits to God's terrifying, awe-inspiring sovereignty. The disciples realize they are in the presence of the holy, and they receive him.
They do.
So what does this all mean? Bringing all of this together, what do we actually have here in these chapters? We have seen the absolute inadequacy of signs faith, a faith that only wants physical benefits and refuses to see the spiritual reality.
They fall short every time.
It is a consumer religion that ends in disappointment. We have seen the undeniable historical reality of Jesus' sovereign provision in the wilderness, exposing the total inability of human resources.
Philip's spreadsheet failed.
Right. Andrew's meager offering failed. Only the sovereign host could provide the feast. And we have seen the severe danger of trying to force a divine king into our own tiny human political molds. Jesus will not be our mascot. He will not be our political quartermaster.
No, he will not.
If you are listening to this right now, I want to address you directly. Why does the feeding of the 5,000 matter for your life today? It matters because it is a mirror held up to your own motives.
A tough mirror to look into.
It forces you to ask a very difficult question. Are you looking for a cosmic vending machine? Are you following Jesus simply because you want him to fix your health, balance your bank account, or validate your cultural views? Or are you looking for the true bread of heaven? Are you willing to receive a king whose kingdom is completely outside your control?
That is the real question.
Think about the silent lad with the barley loaves. We spent a lot of time talking about the crowds, the Pharisees, and the disciples. But think about that boy.
He is easy to overlook.
He is the only human in this entire narrative who actually gets it right. He handed over his entire livelihood for the day, his poor man's lunch, without demanding an explanation, without trying to start a political revolution, and without knowing what would happen.
He just gave it.
And then he completely disappeared from the historical record. He sought zero glory. The massive crowd wanted to violently draft Jesus into their own selfish agenda, but the boy simply surrendered what little he had to the sovereign Lord.
A beautiful picture.
What might happen if you stop trying to crown Jesus on your own terms and instead hand over your vastly insufficient resources to a king who insists on doing the impossible?